Hi guys! Tonight we're drifting back into the earliest edges of the Golden Age of Piracy, where the sea feels both familiar and strange, like a memory you cannot fully place. You are standing on the damp wooden deck of a distant past, where salt hangs in the air and distant sails appear like ghosts on the horizon. The world is not yet divided by clear maps, and every coastline feels like a question waiting for an answer. Ships creak, ropes tighten, and somewhere far off a bell marks a harbour you might never reach. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are watching from and what your local time is, because it always feels strangely human to connect across time zones like drifting ships passing in the night. Now, dim the lights. For a moment, it feels as though you are not in a single century at all, but suspended between older worlds where maritime power was still fragile. You are drifting through waters that once connected empires, where early raiders learned that the sea could be both a road and a weapon, the earliest roots of piracy, as described in historical syntheses from institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Oxford, suggest that maritime raiding existed long before organised navies could reliably enforce control. Trade naturally created opportunity. An opportunity quietly invited disruption. You begin to notice how simple survival once shaped everything. Wooden hulls, stitch sails, and uncertain winds define the rhythm of life. Damp rope fibres press into your hands as if you belong there, as if you have always belonged to motion rather than land. A cold breeze slips across the deck, carrying the smell of tar and old salt. It is not violent yet, but it is never truly peaceful either. Historians often debate the earliest definition of piracy itself. Some scholars associated with research traditions at Yale University and Stanford University argue that early maritime raiding was not originally criminal in the modern sense, but rather an extension of warfare and survival between competing coastal communities. Others suggest a clearer moral boundary existed even in antiquity, where certain acts at sea were already condemned in surviving legal codes. Accounts differ, and no single definition survives unchanged across centuries. Your mind drifts toward the ancient Mediterranean, where small fleets once slipped between islands, targeting merchant vessels that carried grain, oil, and fragile wealth. The water there was crowded with ambition. Even the horizon felt contested. You can almost hear oars cutting into water, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of early maritime conflict. A fisherman might become a raider in a single season if harvests failed. That fragile line between necessity and violence is where piracy first begins to take shape. In those early waters, trade routes were not protected corridors but open invitations. Ships moved slowly, weighed down by cargo and uncertainty. A single fast vessel could change everything in seconds. You feel the tension of that imbalance, like standing in a quiet room just before a storm breaks. There is also something deeply human in these beginnings. A young sailor tightening a knot too tightly because he's afraid of losing his grip. An older navigator watching the sky with tired patience, knowing that weather is never truly predictable. A shared silence on deck that says more than spoken orders ever could. These are not legends yet. They are ordinary lives pressed into extraordinary circumstances. Far away from the Mediterranean, similar patterns begin forming across other seas. Early Asian maritime routes, especially around coastal trade networks, also saw irregular raiding activity that blurred the line between commerce and theft. The ocean does not belong to any single civilization at this stage. It belongs to movement itself. You might notice how sound behaves differently here. The creak of wood seems louder. The wind feels closer. Even your own breath feels like part of the ship. This sensory closeness reflects what life at sea must have felt like when survival depended on constant awareness. And yet, Even in this early chaos, there is structure forming. Small groups of raiders begin recognizing patterns in trade. They learn which routes are predictable, which seasons bring heavier cargo, and which ports lack strong defences. It is not yet the organised piracy of later centuries, but it is no longer random either. Modern historical analysis from the University of Cambridge and other research institutions often emphasises this gradual evolution. Piracy did not begin as a single event or a single culture. It emerged slowly from overlapping pressures, including trade expansion, political fragmentation, and the simple human desire for advantage at sea. You feel that slow emergence like watching ink spread in water. Nothing is sudden, yet everything changes. The sea remains calm for now, but you can sense how quickly that calm can become something else. A sail appears on the horizon, too distant to identify. It might be a merchant vessel, or it might be something that changes the balance of this entire waterway. And in that uncertainty, the early world of piracy quietly takes its first breath. The distant sail slowly dissolves into the haze, leaving you with the uneasy awareness that every shape on the horizon once carried meaning and danger at the same time. The sea does not announce intention, it only reveals movement. You are now drifting deeper into a world where early maritime raiding begins to take form, not yet as legend, but as necessity shaped into habit. Your footing feels unstable, as if the deck itself remembers older voyages. The wood beneath you is rough, salt-eaten, and warm only where bodies have stood before. A faint smell of damp rope and tar lingers in the air, mixing with the sharper edge of sea spray. It is quiet, but not empty. Ships always carry invisible noise, the kind that lives in creaking beams and shifting cargo. In this early phase of maritime history, scholars associated with institutions such as Princeton University and Columbia University often describe seaborne raiding as a byproduct of expanding trade systems. As more goods moved across coastal networks, more opportunities emerged for interception. You begin to understand how fragile early commerce truly was, dependent on weather, distance, and trust that rarely held under pressure. Your mind drifts through ancient coastlines where small vessels waited just beyond sight. There is no formal piracy yet, only opportunistic strikes that blur the boundaries between survival and aggression. A fisherman returning from a poor season might quietly follow a merchant ship. A trader facing political unrest might abandon lawful routes entirely. The sea absorbs all decisions without judgment. You feel a shift in atmosphere, like the ocean itself tightening. The Mediterranean becomes a central violent stage in this unfolding story. Narrow passages between islands create natural choke points, and every crossing becomes a calculated risk. Ships carry amphorae of oil, wine, and grain, but they also carry uncertainty. A single intercepted voyage can shift the balance of an entire coastal settlement. A faint creak rises behind you. It might be the ship, or it might be memory. The sound of wood under strain becomes strangely intimate, as if the vessel is breathing alongside you. You can almost imagine sailors leaning over the rail, scanning the water with tired eyes, knowing that danger does not always announce itself with storms. Historical interpretations from research traditions at the University of Chicago and Yale University suggest that early maritime raiding often grew out of regional instability rather than organized criminal intent. Coastal communities sometimes turned to the sea when land resources became scarce or political control weakened. In that sense, piracy was not a separate world, but an extension of existing struggle. You begin to notice how fluid identity becomes at sea. The same vessel might be a merchant ship one season and a raiding craft the next. Flags mean little without power behind them. Even allegiance feels temporary, shaped more by opportunity than loyalty. This instability creates a kind of silent tension across every wave, farther east. Similar patterns emerge along Asian maritime corridors. Trade networks linking ports and islands create wealth. but also vulnerability. Small fleets learn quickly that speed matters more than strength. A fast approach, a sudden strike, and disappearance into open water becomes a repeated pattern. It is not chaos, but adaptation. You feel a subtle emotional shift here. There is no clear villain yet, no heroic resistance. Instead, there is only the slow shaping of behaviour under pressure. A man tightening a rope knot too firmly because he does not know if he will return. A captain calculating risk not in terms of morality, but survival. A crew learning silence because noise attracts attention. The sea breeze grows cooler. It brushes across your face like a reminder that everything here is temporary. Even islands feel less like destinations and more like pauses between uncertainties. The horizon never stops moving, and neither does the logic of those who sail it. Some early records, preserved and later interpreted by scholars at Harvard University and Stanford University, hint at informal codes of conduct among maritime raiders, not laws in the modern sense, but shared expectations about loyalty, division of spoils, and treatment of captured crews. These hints suggest that even in disorder, humans tend to build structure. You can almost see it forming now. Small groups recognizing patterns, agreements made in low voices, decisions shaped by necessity rather than ideology. The ocean rewards coordination more than chaos, even when that coordination serves destructive ends. A distant gull cuts across the sky, its cry briefly breaking the silence. It reminds you that life persists here in small, persistent ways. Fish beneath the surface, wind across the sails, hands tightening ropes without ceremony, and still, that earlier sail remains in memory. Even if it is no longer visible, the possibility of threat does not need confirmation to shape behaviour. In this world, anticipation is already a form of reality. The early foundations of piracy are no longer distant history now. They are something you are standing inside, as if the sea itself is teaching you how instability becomes system, and how survival slowly turns into pattern. The horizon feels closer now, as if the sea itself is narrowing its attention around you. The open water is no longer simply a passage between lands, but a crowded corridor of competing intentions. You're drifting into a time when maritime routes begin to harden into patterns, and those patterns quietly give rise to something more organised, more deliberate, and far more persistent than simple opportunistic raiding. The ship beneath you moves with a steady, tired rhythm. Each plank creaks in a slightly different tone, like voices speaking without words. The air tastes sharper now, carrying salt mixed with the faint bitterness of old tar and damp canvas. You notice how the wind no longer feels random. It follows channels between islands and coastlines, shaping movement the way rivers shape soil. Across the Mediterranean world, early maritime raiding begins to develop into loosely connected networks. You are no longer witnessing isolated acts, but a web of interaction stretching between ports, coves, and trading cities. Coastal communities begin to recognize names, not of individuals, but of feared routes and familiar threats. The sea becomes a map of risk rather than distance. Your mind drifts through narrow straits where merchant ships once travelled with cautious predictability. These routes are filled with slow vessels carrying grain, ceramics, textiles, and metal goods. Every journey depends on timing, weather, and the hope that no hidden sails are waiting beyond the next headland. The ocean here feels like a corridor with unseen eyes watching from every direction. Historical interpretations from institutions such as the University of Oxford and Stanford University suggest that the expansion of interconnected trade routes in the ancient Mediterranean unintentionally created the structural conditions for organised piracy. As commerce intensified, so did the incentives for interception, especially in regions where political control was fragmented or inconsistent. You can almost feel that fragmentation in the water itself. One coastline is governed by a stable authority, while the next is divided among competing cities or local powers. This unevenness creates opportunities. A ship that is safe in one jurisdiction becomes vulnerable the moment it crosses into another. The sea does not recognize borders, but human conflict tries to impose them anyway. A faint shift in sound pulls your attention upward. The wind passes through rigging, producing a soft, uneven whistle. It feels almost like distant conversation. You imagine crews on other ships listening to the same wind, interpreting it differently depending on their cargo, their destination, and their fears. Within this environment, piracy begins to take on structure, not formal institutions, but repeated relationships. Certain coastal groups become associated with specific waters. Certain inlets become known as safe harbours for those avoiding authority. Over time, information spreads through sailors, merchants, and local intermediaries, creating informal networks that support both trade and raiding. You begin to notice how knowledge itself becomes a form of power. Knowing when a convoy will pass, knowing which escort ships are weak, knowing which seasonal winds favour escape. These fragments of information move quietly between people, shaping decisions long before ships ever meet on the water. There is a human intimacy to this system that is easy to overlook. A sailor tightening a sail not just for wind, but for survival. A merchant calculating risk not in abstract terms, but in lost cargo and unpaid debts. A coastal guide who knows hidden bays better than official charts ever could. Each role is small, but together they form an invisible architecture across the sea. Scholars associated with Harvard University and Yale University often emphasize that early Mediterranean piracy should not be understood as a single unified force. Instead, it functioned as a shifting network of localized actors whose behavior changed depending on political stability, economic pressure, and seasonal trade cycles. In some periods, raiding decreased significantly. In others, it surged in with little warning. You feel that unpredictability in the water around you. Calm surfaces can hide sudden intention. A ship that appears alone may be part of a larger pattern. Even silence becomes suspicious. The ocean no longer feels empty. It feels observant. Far below, unseen currents move steadily, indifferent to human concerns. Above, sails adjust constantly, responding to winds that change without warning. This constant adaptation becomes the defining rhythm of life at sea. Nothing remains fixed for long, not routes, not alliances, not safety. Accounts preserved in later historical reconstructions and analysed by researchers at institutions such as Columbia University suggest that certain coastal regions developed semi-stable relationships with maritime raiders. In some cases, informal agreements allowed passage or trade in exchange for goods or reduced hostility. These arrangements were fragile, but they reveal how blurred the boundary between commerce and piracy could become. You can almost sense those negotiations happening in shadowed harbours. Quiet exchanges at night, goods moved without official record, words spoken carefully, because the wrong tone could shift balance from cooperation to conflict. The sea listens, but it does not record promises. A distant wooden groan echoes through the ship again. This time it feels heavier, like the vessel is carrying not just cargo, but memory. You realise how much of maritime life depends on repetition. The same routes travelled again and again, the same decisions made under similar conditions, and yet, each voyage carries a different outcome. The Mediterranean becomes a living system of pressure and response. Trade expands, piracy adapts, security increases, raiders shift tactics, new ports rise, old routes fade, nothing stays still long enough to become permanent. Even power itself feels temporary here. You begin to understand how this environment shapes people over time. A young sailor learns caution before confidence. A trader learns patience before trust. A raider learns timing before aggression. These lessons are not taught formally. They're absorbed through experience, through risk, through survival. And somewhere in this evolving system, the earliest recognizable patterns of organized piracy begin to solidify, not as a unified empire of crime, but as a persistent shadow woven into the fabric of maritime life, a shadow that moves whenever opportunity appears and disappears whenever authority grows too strong. The sea remains calm for now, but you can feel how easily that calm could shift into something sharper, something more decisive, something that history will later struggle to fully contain. The water around you begins to feel less like open distance and more like a network of invisible paths. Each current seems to carry intention, as if the sea itself remembers every voyage that has passed through it. You are now moving deeper into a world where expansion changes everything, and where new trade routes quietly reshape the meaning of power on the water. The ship's motion feels steadier here, but also heavier, not because of cargo alone, but because of expectation. You can hear the slow drag of wood against water, the patient rhythm of travel that no longer feels exploratory, but habitual. The air smells of wet rope, aged timber, and the faint sweetness of distant land carried on wind. As maritime exploration expands beyond older regional boundaries, the structure of trade begins to transform. You drift into an era where connections between continents slowly intensify, and with that intensification comes vulnerability. Historical studies associated with institutions such as the University of Cambridge and the University of Chicago describe how expanding trade networks naturally increase the number of interception points available to opportunistic raiders. You begin to sense how opportunity spreads like ripples. A single new route does not remain isolated. It branches, it multiplies. Each merchant ship that crosses a new corridor unknowingly creates information for others to follow. And where information flows, so does anticipation. The sea becomes less mysterious and more calculated, but also more dangerous. A faint creak above you draws attention upward. The sails shift slightly, catching wind that feels different from earlier waters. It is stronger here, more consistent, as if these routes have been used so often that even the wind has adapted to them. The ocean is no longer random, it has patterns now, and patterns can be learned. Your mind drifts toward early Atlantic expansion, where new maritime routes begin linking distant economies in ways previously unimaginable. Ships carry not only goods but also expectations of profit, expansion, and control. With every successful voyage, confidence grows, and with confidence comes risk taken without full awareness of consequence. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often highlight a key tension in this period. On one hand, expanding trade requires stability and protection. On the other hand, the very existence of wealth moving across predictable routes creates incentives for disruption. You feel this contradiction like pressure building beneath calm water. The deck beneath your feet shifts slightly as the ship adjusts course. You imagine captains studying early maps, uncertain of coastlines that are still being defined through experience rather than certainty. Paper charts are incomplete, and even the most skilled navigators rely heavily on memory, instinct, and the stories of other sailors. In this environment, piracy begins to evolve beyond small coastal raids. It starts to align with the structure of trade itself. Instead of random attacks, there are now expectations about timing instead of isolated incidents. There are patterns of interception. The sea becomes a space where knowledge of routes is as valuable as physical strength. You can almost feel the tension in every passing wave. A merchant vessel sailing alone is no longer just a ship, it is a calculation. How heavily is it armed? How fast can it escape? How far is help? These questions define survival long before any encounter happens. A distant spray of cold water touches your face. Sudden and grounding, the sensation feels almost like a reminder that all of this is physical. Wood, wind, salt, exhaustion. Nothing here is abstract. Everything is felt directly. Historical interpretations preserved through research traditions at the University of Oxford and Columbia University suggest that as global trade routes expanded, piracy increasingly mirrored the structure of legitimate commerce. Raiders learned to track schedules, anticipate seasonal flows, and position themselves along predictable maritime corridors. This shift marks a crucial transition from opportunistic violence to strategic interception. You begin to see ships not as isolated entities, but as part of a flowing system. Each vessel is a point in a larger rhythm of movement. When one disappears, others adjust. When one succeeds, others follow. The ocean becomes less like empty space and more like a living circulation system of human ambition. Far below the surface, unseen currents continue their ancient movement. Above, sails adjust constantly to shifting winds. Between these layers, human decisions carve temporary patterns of order and chaos. Nothing remains fixed for long. There is also a quieter emotional undercurrent here, a sense of anticipation that never fully resolves. Sailors learn to live inside this unresolved space, waiting for land, waiting for signal, waiting for the moment when calm becomes action. Even rest feels temporary, like a pause between uncertainties. You imagine a young sailor gripping the rail a little too tightly, not from fear alone, but from awareness that knowledge of danger does not remove it. An experienced navigator watching the horizon with calm eyes, understanding that control is always partial. A merchant calculating loss not in abstract numbers, but in future consequences that ripple outward. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Harvard University and Princeton University suggest that the expansion of maritime trade during this era did not simply increase piracy, but fundamentally changed its structure. It created what could be described as a parallel system of economic activity, one that mirrored legitimate trade routes but operated outside formal authority. You feel that parallel structure forming around you now, not as something separate from the sea, but embedded within it. A shadow system that moves whenever opportunity appears and adapts whenever resistance grows. The wind shifts again, carrying with it a faint sense of approaching congestion. More ships, more routes, more intersections of movement. The ocean feels less empty than before, and with that fullness comes a quiet, persistent tension. And somewhere within this expanding network of trade and risk, the conditions are quietly forming for a new kind of maritime world, one where piracy is no longer an exception, but an expected shadow alongside every voyage. The sea does not announce this change, it simply carries it forward. The ocean around you begins to feel warmer now, not in temperature alone, but in presence. It is as if more lives are moving through these waters, each one leaving a faint trace that lingers in the salt air. You are entering a region where piracy is no longer an occasional disturbance, but a recognizable force shaped by environment, survival, and the expanding reach of maritime travel. The ship creaks with a deeper rhythm, almost like a tired heartbeat. The wood beneath your feet carries the memory of countless crossings, each one adding weight that cannot be measured. The air smells of damp canvas, stale water in barrels, and something faintly earthy carried from distant tropical shores. You feel the sea breathing more actively now, as if it has become crowded with intention. As European exploration pushes further into the Atlantic and Caribbean waters, new maritime corridors begin to form. Historical research associated with institutions such as the University of Oxford and Stanford University suggests that this expansion created vast, loosely governed zones where enforcement of law was inconsistent and often symbolic rather than practical. You begin to understand how space itself becomes permissive when authority is distant. The wind changes here. It feels less structured, more playful, yet unpredictable. It slips between sails and rigging like a living thing testing boundaries. You can almost hear distant echoes of unfamiliar ports, places where ships arrive carrying goods, rumours, and uncertainty. Every voyage feels longer, not just in distance, but in emotional weight. You drift into the early atmosphere of the Caribbean world, where geography itself reshapes human behaviour. Islands appear and disappear through haze, their coastlines irregular and inviting. Shallow waters hide reefs that can break ships as easily as conflict can. In this environment, movement becomes both opportunity and risk at every turn. Scholars from Yale University and Columbia University often emphasize that piracy in this period is deeply tied to the instability of expanding colonial systems. As new trade routes formed between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, ships carried immense wealth across vast distances, but protection rarely kept pace with expansion. You feel this imbalance like pressure building beneath calm waves. A sudden shift in the ship's motion draws your attention. The vessel tilts slightly, correcting course as if avoiding unseen obstacles. It reminds you that navigation here is never fully secure. Every decision depends on incomplete knowledge. Even the best captains rely on fragments of information stitched together through experience and intuition. Your mind drifts toward early buccaneer activity in Caribbean waters. These were not yet the romanticized figures of later legend, but hardened maritime actors shaped by necessity and opportunity. Many began as hunters or displaced sailors, adapting quickly to environments where survival required flexibility rather than loyalty. You feel the salt wind more intensely now. It presses against your skin, leaving a faint dryness that lingers. The ropes above you groan softly, responding to shifting pressure. Every sound feels amplified, as if the sea is speaking in a language of tension and movement. Historical interpretations preserved in academic discussions at Harvard University and Princeton University suggest that the rise of Caribbean piracy cannot be separated from the economic demands of colonial expansion. Sugar, tobacco, and other high-value goods created intense pressure on shipping routes, making them both essential and vulnerable. You begin to see how value itself attracts disruption. There is a quiet human moment here, almost hidden beneath the larger structure of history. A sailor tightening a worn belt before a long voyage, knowing that comfort will not return for weeks. A navigator tracing coastline shapes in his mind while staring at empty horizon. A dock worker unloading crates under humid air, aware that every object has crossed dangerous distance to arrive here. The sea around you feels thicker now, as if layered with invisible routes crossing in every direction. Ships do not simply travel from point to point, they follow invisible currents of commerce, wind, and timing within these currents. Opportunities for interception multiply naturally. You notice how perception changes with repetition. A distant sail no longer feels neutral. It becomes a question. A cluster of ships on the horizon becomes a calculation. Even silence becomes suspicious when movement is expected. This psychological shift is part of what transforms piracy from random action into structured presence. Some scholars from the University of Chicago and Stanford University describe this transformation as the emergence of a maritime shadow economy, not a formal system, but a parallel rhythm of activity that mirrors legitimate trade routes. It depends on the same geography, the same winds, and the same seasonal patterns, yet operates outside official control. You can almost feel that shadow forming now, not as something separate from the ocean, but woven into it. It moves where ships move. It waits where ships must pass. It adapts whenever pressure increases. It is not chaos. It is responsiveness shaped by opportunity. A faint spray of water reaches the deck. Cool and sudden, it grounds you for a moment, reminding you that everything here is physical and immediate. The ocean does not care about definitions. It only responds to movement and force. The horizon remains open, but it no longer feels empty. Even absence feels meaningful here. Every stretch of water carries potential presence. Every sentence carries the possibility of change. And somewhere within this expanding, crowded maritime world, the early foundations of what will later be known as the Golden Age of Piracy are quietly solidifying, not through a single event, but through countless small adjustments made by those who live and travel across these waters. The sea continues forward, indifferent yet fully aware in its own way, carrying both commerce and its shadow across the same endless surface. The water begins to feel less like a boundary and more like a corridor carved by constant movement. You are no longer drifting through empty sea. Instead, you are inside a living system of routes, where every current seems to carry memory, and every horizon holds the faint echo of passing ships. The deck beneath your feet shifts with a steadier rhythm now, as if the vessel has learned the language of these waters. Wood groans softly under tension, ropes creak in slow agreement with the wind, and the sails above you breathe in long, deliberate cycles. The air carries salt, wet fibre, and the faint smoke of distant ports that no longer feel distant in your imagination. As European maritime powers expand their naval reach, a new and complicated phenomenon begins to take shape on the seas. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as the University of Cambridge and Harvard University suggest that state-sanctioned private warfare begins to blur the boundary between legitimate naval conflict and independent raiding. You start to feel how easily authority can become ambiguous when projected across vast oceans. The wind feels different here. It is no longer only nature. It feels guided by patterns of trade and conflict, shaping movement across invisible lines. You can almost sense ships adjusting sails far beyond your sight, all responding to the same shifting pressure of commerce and competition. Your mind drifts toward early privateering practices, where governments granted letters of authorization to private captains, allowing them to attack enemy vessels during wartime. This arrangement creates an uneasy overlap between legality and piracy. One ship is a lawful combatant in one season and a criminal target in another. The sea becomes a space where identity depends on perspective rather than fixed definition. A faint vibration runs through the ship as it cuts through a slightly rougher patch of water. It is subtle but constant, like a reminder that motion here is never entirely smooth. Even calm seas carry hidden instability beneath the surface. Scholars from Yale University and Princeton University often emphasize that this period marks a critical transformation in maritime conflict. Naval warfare becomes decentralized, and power is distributed across both official fleets and privately equipped vessels. You begin to understand how this decentralization creates opportunities for individuals operating at the edges of authority. The smell of tar grows stronger for a moment as a sailor above adjusts rigging. It is a sharp, grounding scent, reminding you of labour and maintenance, of constant adjustment required to keep anything afloat in these waters. Nothing here functions without attention. Even silence requires upkeep. You imagine the deck at night, lit only by the lantern glow, where captains and crews calculate distance, risk, and opportunity. Maps are incomplete, coastlines uncertain, and decisions are often made based on partial knowledge. In such conditions, flexibility becomes more valuable than certainty. There is a human texture to this world that emerges in small, quiet moments, a navigator rubbing tired eyes after hours of uncertain plotting. A young sailor listening to older voices describe routes that may or may not still exist in the same form. A shared meal eaten in silence because exhaustion leaves no room for conversation. Historical research from institutions such as Stanford University and the University of Chicago suggests that the expansion of private maritime warfare contributes directly to the normalization of irregular naval activity. What begins as state-controlled privateering gradually creates a population of experienced sea fighters who operate comfortably outside formal command structures. You feel this slow transition like sediment settling into new shape beneath the ocean. The horizon ahead remains open, but it feels increasingly structured. You begin to notice how certain routes become preferred corridors, how certain winds favour certain passages, how ships naturally cluster along efficient paths, even when those paths are not officially defined. The sea is forming habits. A brief shift in light catches your attention. Sunlight reflects off distant water in fragmented patterns, like broken glass scattered across the surface. It is beautiful, but also disorienting. In this light, it becomes harder to judge distance, harder to know what is near and what is far. Some scholarly debates preserved in academic discussions at the University of Oxford and Columbia University suggest that the rise of privateering fundamentally altered maritime identity. Sailors began to operate within a fluid moral framework, where legality was conditional and often temporary. You begin to see how this ambiguity becomes fertile ground for later developments in piracy. The ship steadies again. Returning to its slow rhythmic motion, you can feel the subtle cooperation between human design and natural force. Every sail adjustment, every rope tension, every course correction is part of a continuous negotiation with the sea. There is also a quieter psychological shift happening now. The idea of other ships no longer feels distant, it feels imminent. Even if none are visible, their possibility is always present. The ocean feels populated by unseen decisions. You imagine vessels crossing paths beyond the horizon, each unaware of the others until the final moment of encounter. Sometimes those encounters lead to trade, sometimes to avoidance, and sometimes to sudden, irreversible conflict that reshapes entire routes. The wind softens slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of land that may or may not be real yet. It is a reminder that every voyage still depends on arrival, even in a world where uncertainty dominates movement. And somewhere within this expanding system of private war, trade ambition, and shifting authority, the conditions that will later define large-scale piracy continue to take shape, not as an interruption of history, but as one of its natural consequences. The sea moves forward without hesitation, carrying every intention, lawful or not, upon the same unbroken surface. The sea begins to feel busier now, even when no ships are visible. It is a strange sensation, like standing in a silent room that you know is filled with unseen movement. You're entering a phase of maritime history, where ports become louder, routes become more defined, and certain coastal cities begin to pulse with a constant arrival and departure. The ship rocks gently beneath you, but the rhythm feels more purposeful than before. Each movement is tied to wind patterns that have been studied, followed, and repeated by countless sailors. The deck is worn smooth in places where footsteps have passed for years, leaving behind a quiet record of human repetition. The air is thick with salt, damp wood, and the faint sweetness of distant land carried across long travel. As colonial expansion accelerates across the Atlantic world, port cities begin to transform into critical nodes of global exchange. Historical research associated with institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggests that this rapid growth of maritime trade created dense shipping networks, where wealth and vulnerability move together along the same paths. You begin to feel how proximity alone can generate both prosperity and danger. Your mind drifts toward a coastline at night, where lantern light flickers across wet stone docks. Ships arrive heavily loaded, their hulls low in the water, carrying goods that represent entire economies. Every arrival is a moment of relief and tension combined. Relief that the voyage has survived. Tension because survival does not guarantee safety for long. You notice how sound travels differently in these imagined harbours. The clang of metal chains, the shouts of dock workers, the low murmur of negotiations that happen just out of official view. Even silence here feels temporary, always interrupted by the next arrival. Within this expanding system of trade, piracy begins to find something essential, not just opportunity, but infrastructure. Ships follow predictable routes between major ports, Winds dictate seasonal patterns. Insurance systems and trade agreements encourage consistency, and consistency creates vulnerability. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that piracy in this era cannot be separated from the structure of global commerce itself. The more organized trade becomes, the more structured the opportunities for interception also become. You feel this paradox like a slow tightening of pressure beneath calm water. A slight shift in wind brushes across your face, carrying the faint scent of distant vegetation and smoke. It is subtle, but it changes the atmosphere of the entire scene. The ocean no longer feels purely open. It feels connected to many unseen lands, each contributing something to the air you breathe. You begin to imagine ships waiting beyond coastal bends, positioned not randomly but deliberately. Not chaos, but anticipation, a kind of patience that depends on knowledge of routes and timing. Every successful voyage by a merchant vessel becomes a source of information for others who are watching. There is a quiet human reality beneath all of this movement. A captain studying cargo lists by lantern light. A sailor mending torn canvas while listening to stories of previous voyages. A dock official weighing decisions that may never appear in official records. These small acts accumulate into systems far larger than any individual. Historical interpretations preserved in academic discussions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggest that as maritime trade intensified, informal intelligence networks naturally developed among sailors, merchants, and coastal communities. Information about ship movements, cargo value, and seasonal schedules travelled quickly and often unofficially. You begin to see how the knowledge itself becomes part of the maritime economy. The ship beneath you responds to the sea with steady confidence, but even that confidence feels earned rather than absolute. Every voyage depends on countless small decisions that could easily have gone differently. A shift in wind, a delayed departure, a missed warning. The horizon remains open, yet it feels increasingly structured, as if invisible lines are being drawn across the water. These lines are not physical, but behavioral. Ships begin to follow them out of necessity, shaping the sea into corridors of expectation. Some scholarly debates from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that the expansion of global maritime trade during this period created a form of systemic predictability. While trade brought wealth and connection, it also unintentionally standardized movement across vast distances. You feel that standardization is quiet with the wow. A brief creak rises from the rigging above you, followed by a moment of stillness. It feels like the ship is listening, or perhaps it is you who are listening more closely now. The boundary between observer and environment begins to soften at sea, where everything is in motion and nothing remains separate for long. You imagine ships crossing in the distance, unseen but anticipated, each one carrying cargo, hope, fear, and the invisible weight of expectation. Some will reach their destination, some will not. And between those outcomes lies the space where piracy grows more structured, more calculated, and more deeply embedded in the logic of maritime life. The wind shifts again, slightly colder now, as if reminding you that every system built on movement is also built on uncertainty. The sea does not distinguish between lawful passage and opportunistic interception. It only responds to presence and possibility. And within this expanding, interconnected world of ports, routes, and invisible knowledge, piracy continues to evolve quietly, not as a disruption from outside, but as an adaptation from within. The ocean carries everything forward, unchanged in surface, yet transformed in structure beneath. The sea feels more organized now, as if invisible hands have begun to shape its chaos into something closer to pattern. You're no longer drifting through uncertainty alone. You're moving through a system that has learned to anticipate itself, where ships, ports, and people all begin to behave like parts of a larger rhythm. The deck beneath your feet feels familiar in its creaks, yet each sound now carries a kind of meaning you did not notice before. A rope tightening is not just maintenance, it is preparation. A shifting sail is not just wind adjustment, it is decision. Even the smallest sounds seem to belong to a language the sea has taught over time, as maritime trade expands further across the Atlantic and Caribbean networks. Port cities grow into complex hubs of exchange. Historical studies associated with the institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggest that this period marks a critical shift where shipping routes become increasingly predictable due to economic consolidation and seasonal trade cycles. You begin to feel how predictability, once a symbol of safety, slowly becomes a source of exposure. Your mind drifts to a crowded harbour at dawn. Ships line the water like waiting thoughts, their masts forming a forest of vertical lines against the pale sky. Dockworkers move in constant motion, unloading barrels, crates, and cloth. Voices overlap, yet no single voice dominates. It is a place where motion never fully pauses. You notice the smell of this imagined harbour even from here. Salt mixed with damp rope, smoke from cooking fires, and the faint metallic scent of cargo being handled. It is overwhelming, but strangely ordered, like a system that survives through repetition rather than design. Within this environment, piracy begins to take on a more structured identity, not as isolated acts, but as responses to economic flow. Ships are no longer simply targets of opportunity, they are part of a predictable circulation of wealth. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often note that when trade routes stabilize, they inadvertently create channels of expectation that can be studied, anticipated, and exploited. You feel this concept take shape like invisible lines across the water, not drawn on maps, but written in behaviour. Certain ships depart at certain times, certain goods follow certain seasons, certain ports become unavoidable intersections of movement, and wherever movement becomes predictable, vulnerability quietly follows. A gentle sway of the ship pulls you back into the present moment. The wood beneath you shifts with ocean rhythm, steady but never still. Above, sails stretch and adjust like living membranes responding to pressure. The wind is not random here, it feels guided by repetition, shaped by centuries of travel along the same invisible paths. There is a human weight to all of this that begins to surface more clearly now. A merchant checking inventory with careful hands, aware that every barrel represents investment and risk. A sailor listening to distant stories of ships that never returned. A captain studying the horizon not for beauty, but for interruption. Historical interpretations preserved through research traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggest that the expansion of maritime commerce created not only wealth, but also a parallel system of information exchange. Sailors, dock workers, and merchants formed informal networks where news of ship movements travelled quickly, often outside official channels. You begin to see how knowledge becomes as valuable as cargo. The horizon feels closer again. Though nothing has physically changed, it is perception that has shifted. You now expect presence, even in absence. A distant sail is no longer just a shape, it is possibility. Every ripple of light across the water feels like a signal waiting to be interpreted. You imagine ships positioned quietly along coastal bends, waiting not in haste but in patience. They do not rush the sea, they learn it. They learn when currents slow, when winds shift, when trade routes become most active. This is not disorder, it is adaptation shaped by attention. Some scholarly debates from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that piracy during this period increasingly mirrored the logic of trade itself. Instead of opposing the system from outside, it operated within its patterns, responding directly to the rhythms of commerce. you begin to understand how closely order and disruption can coexist in the same space. A soft gust passes across the deck, carrying the faint scent of distant rain. It cools the air for a moment, making everything feel more immediate. You notice how even weather becomes part of this structured uncertainty. Storms alter routes. Calm seas create opportunity. Nothing exists outside influence. The ship continues forward, steady but attentive. Every movement feels like participation in a larger design that no single crew fully controls. Even silence feels shared, as if the ocean itself is holding information just beyond reach. And within this carefully formed system of predictable trade and adaptive response, the early foundations of organized piracy continue to deepen, not as a break from maritime order, but as one of its most responsive reflections. The sea carries all of it forward, unchanged in appearance, yet increasingly complex beneath its surface rhythm. The ocean around you feels quieter now, but it is not empty. It is the kind of quiet that only exists when too many things are happening at once. Too far away to be seen clearly. You're entering a space where ships, people, and intentions begin to overlap so completely that separation becomes difficult to define. The ship beneath you moves with a steady, practiced confidence. Every plank creaks in familiar rhythm, as if the vessel itself has learned the language of long-distance travel. The sails above you shift gently, catching wind that feels both constant and unpredictable. The air carries salt, damp wood, and the faint trace of tar warmed by sun and time. As maritime trade networks expand across the Atlantic and Caribbean worlds, shipping lanes become increasingly dense and structured. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as the University of Cambridge and Harvard University suggest that this growing density of movement creates a paradox. The more efficient and predictable trade becomes, the more clearly its vulnerabilities begin to emerge. You start to feel how organization itself can generate exposure. Your mind drifts into the interior of a ship. It is narrow, dim, and filled with overlapping sounds. The groan of timber under pressure, the soft shuffle of boots on wood, the distant rhythm of waves pressing against the hull. Space here is not open. It is layered, compact, and constantly in motion. You imagine sailors resting in brief intervals between duties. Their sleep is shallow, interrupted by shifts in wind or command. A hand tightens a rope without looking. A voice calls out a change in direction without hesitation. Life at sea is a continuous negotiation between human effort and natural force. Within this environment, piracy begins to take on a more precise form. Not just opportunistic raids, but calculated interception based on knowledge of movement patterns. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that as maritime systems became more structured, so too did the methods used to exploit them. You begin to see how structure itself becomes a map for disruption. A faint vibration passes through the deck as the ship adjusts its angle to the wind. It feels subtle, but it changes everything. The horizon shifts slightly, not physically, but in perception. What once felt distant now feels reachable, and what once felt empty now feels populated with unseen motion. There is a quiet human presence in this system that begins to emerge more clearly, a navigator tracing routes by memory rather than certainty, a merchant calculating delays caused by weather and distance, a sailor listening for changes in the wind before they are visible. Each role depends on attention, patience, and adaptation. Historical research preserved through academic discussions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that this period saw the rise of informal maritime intelligence networks. Information about ship departures, cargo value, and seasonal timing circulated through ports faster than official records could keep up. You begin to understand how information itself becomes a kind of currency. The sea feels more structured now, as if invisible lines are forming across its surface. These lines are not physical routes, but behavioral patterns. Ships follow them because efficiency demands it. Winds reinforce them because geography allows it. Over time, repetition turns movement into expectation. You can almost feel that expectation in the air. A ship arriving late becomes notable. A route deviating from pattern becomes suspicious. Even silence between ports begins to carry meaning. The ocean is no longer simply space. It is information in motion. Some scholarly debates from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that maritime expansion during this period unintentionally created standardized patterns of movement that could be predicted with increasing accuracy. You begin to feel how predictability becomes both a tool of progress and a source of risk. A soft shift of wind brushes across the deck, carrying a faint coolness that contrasts with the warmth of earlier air. It feels like a reminder that even within structure, uncertainty never fully disappears. Weather still changes without warning. Currents still shift without explanation. The sea retains its independence. You imagine ships travelling along established corridors, each one aware that others are likely following similar paths. Encounters at sea become more probable, more anticipated, and more strategically significant. Every meeting carries potential meaning, whether peaceful or hostile. There is something deeply human in this increasing complexity. A sailor glancing towards the horizon longer than necessary. A captain pausing before committing to a route. A crew falling into silence when passing through to known risk zones. These small behaviours accumulate into a shared awareness of unseen presence. Scholars from Harvard University and Yale University often note that piracy during this era increasingly depended on anticipation rather than chance. It was not randomness that shaped encounters, but knowledge of patterns. You begin to understand how deeply observation itself can shape outcomes. The ship continues forward, steady against the widening web of maritime activity. Every movement feels slightly more informed than before, as if the sea itself is becoming aware of its own structure through repetition. And within this growing system of predictable motion and hidden awareness, piracy evolves further into a disciplined shadow of trade, shaped not by chaos but by understanding how order moves. The ocean carries everything forward, calm on the surface, intricate beneath, endlessly connected in ways that only time can fully reveal. The sea feels closer now, as if every stretch of water has been measured and memorized by countless journeys before you. You're no longer moving through an unknown world. You're moving through a system that remembers movement, a living network of routes, expectations, and encounters waiting just beyond sight. The ship creaks with a deeper familiarity, its rhythm almost comforting if you listen long enough. Wood shifts under pressure, ropes tighten and loosen in practice cycles, and the sails above respond with quiet obedience to winds that have been studied for generations. The air tastes of salt, worn timber, and the faint metallic edge of distant storm still far beyond the horizon. As maritime commerce expands further across interconnected oceans, naval encounters become more frequent and more calculated. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as the University of Cambridge and Stanford University suggest that increased trade density directly influenced the evolution of naval tactics, including both defensive escort systems and opportunistic interception strategies. You begin to feel how movement itself becomes a kind of intelligence. Your mind drifts toward open water where visibility stretches endlessly, yet meaning concentrates into small details. A sail far away is no longer just a shape. It is a question. Its angle, its speed, its hesitation all become clues that must be interpreted before any encounter occurs. You imagine the tension aboard ships travelling through contested waters, the quiet adjustments of course that happen without announcement, the way conversations pause when something unusual appears on the horizon. Even routine tasks begin to carry a sense of anticipation, as if every action might matter more than it seems. Within this environment, Piracy becomes increasingly technical, no longer purely opportunistic. It begins to rely on observation, timing, and an understanding of maritime rhythm. Scholars from Yale University and the University of Chicago often emphasize that as shipping routes became more established, the skill of predicting movement became as important as the act of interception itself. You can feel this transformation like a shift in the texture of the sea. A faint roll of the ship beneath your feet reminds you that everything here depends on balance. The vessel is constantly correcting itself, adjusting to forces that never fully stabilize. Wind, current, cargo weight, and human decision all interact in subtle negotiation. Nothing is ever still. The scent of damp rope grows stronger as a sailor above your imagined position adjusts rigging. It is a small action, yet it echoes through the entire structure of the ship. You realize how deeply interconnected every part of this environment is, how one adjustment can influence everything else in motion. There is a quiet human layer beneath these systems that begins to surface more clearly now. A navigator tracing likely routes not on maps alone, but through memory built from repetition. A captain weighing risk against timing, knowing that hesitation can be as costly as action. A sailor watching the horizon not with curiosity, but with trained attention. Historical research preserved through academic discussions at institutions such as Harvard University and Princeton University suggests that maritime expansion during this period created increasingly predictable corridors of movement. Trade followed efficiency. Efficiency created repetition. And repetition created opportunity for those who understood how to read it. You begin to see how structure and vulnerability grow from the same root. The horizon feels slightly different now, not closer, not farther, but more layered. You begin to sense that what appears empty is often structured by invisible patterns. Ships moving in parallel routes, seasonal winds guiding predictable crossings, ports acting as fixed points in a constantly shifting system. A soft shift in light passes over the water, scattering reflections across small waves. It feels almost like scattered signals, fragments of movement that hint at activity beyond immediate perception. The sea is no longer silent. It is filled with implied presence. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Columbia University and the University of Oxford suggest that the rise of organized maritime activity created a parallel logic of anticipation. Ships were not only reacting to what they saw, but to what they expected to see based on established patterns. You begin to understand how expectation itself becomes a navigational force. The ship steadies again, continuing its forward motion with quiet persistence. Every movement feels intentional. Even when driven by forces beyond control, the ocean does not resist this structure. It absorbs it, reshaping it gently with every passing voyage. You imagine distant crews adjusting sails in similar conditions, all unknowingly participating in the same larger system. Some carry goods of immense value. Others carry modest cargo that still follows the same predictable paths. All of them move within a shared rhythm that connects them across vast distance. There is something deeply human in this repetition, the need for routes that work, the reliance on patterns that can be trusted, the gradual shaping of behavior through experience and necessity. Even fear becomes structured over time, turning uncertainty into procedure. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that piracy in this period increasingly depended on understanding these procedural patterns. It was not enough to be strong or fast. It required knowledge of timing, observation of repetition, and patience that could stretch across days or weeks of waiting. A faint breeze crosses the deck, carrying with it a coolness that contrasts with earlier warmth. It feels like a reminder that even in structured systems, unpredictability never disappears completely. The sea still holds its own authority, reshaping all plans with simple changes in wind or weather. And within this growing world of predictable routes and adaptive responses, piracy continues to refine itself into something more calculated, more integrated, and more deeply tied to the logic of maritime life itself. The ocean moves forward without interruption, carrying commerce, anticipation, and its shadow along the same endless surface. The horizon begins to feel heavier now, as if it is carrying not just distance but memory. You're moving deeper into a world where the sea is no longer simply a pathway between places, but a stage where reputation, fear, and identity begin to shape the movement of every vessel. The ship beneath you feels more disciplined in its motion. Every creak of timber sounds familiar, almost rehearsed. The sails respond to the wind with practiced ease, adjusting in small, precise movements that suggest experience layered upon experience. The air is thick with salt, sun-warmed rope, and the faint trace of smoke from distant coastal fires you cannot yet see. As maritime routes become more established across the Atlantic and Caribbean waters, certain figures begin to rise above the general noise of seafaring life. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggest that individual notoriety at sea begins to carry increasing strategic weight. A name, a rumour, or even a silhouette on the horizon can alter the behaviour of entire crews. Your mind drifts into waters where fear travels faster than ships. A single report of a dangerous vessel spreads through ports long before that vessel ever arrives. Sailors begin to adjust routes preemptively, sometimes avoiding entire regions based on hearsay alone. The ocean becomes shaped not only by wind and current, but by perception. You can almost feel that psychological pressure now. The way the horizon is watched more carefully than before. The way silence between waves feels less neutral. Even calm water seems to hold possibility. Within this evolving environment, piracy begins to take on a recognizable identity through reputation. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that maritime power in this era is not defined solely by numbers or firepower, but by reputation networks that spread through sailors, merchants, and port communities. You begin to understand how fear itself becomes a navigational force. A faint shift in the ship's motion draws your awareness downward. The hull presses through water with steady resistance, each movement pushing against an invisible weight. It is a reminder that travel here is never effortless. Every mile is earned through constant negotiation with the sea. The smell of damp wood intensifies for a moment as waves strike the hull slightly harder. You notice how even small changes in water texture can alter the entire feeling of motion. Nothing here is uniform. Everything is variation layered upon variation. You imagine port conversations unfolding in low voices, a merchant warning another merchant about ships that do not behave like ordinary vessels, a sailor describing an encounter that left more uncertainty than clarity, a dock worker repeating stories he heard but did not witness. These fragments travel faster than official information, shaping expectations across entire regions. Historical research preserved through academic traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that informal communication networks played a crucial role in shaping maritime behavior during this period. Rumors, partial reports, and repeated stories often influenced route selection as much as formal navigation charts. You begin to see how knowledge becomes fragmented yet powerful. The sea around you feels increasingly structured by anticipation. Ships do not simply move from origin to destination. They move through layers of expectation built by those who have travelled before them. Every route carries invisible warnings and invisible permissions. A soft breeze passes across the deck, carrying the faint scent of distant wood smoke and open shoreline vegetation. It is subtle, but it changes the emotional texture of the moment. The sea no longer feels isolated. It feels connected to many unseen human lives beyond the horizon. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that the growth of maritime commerce during this era led to the emergence of what could be described as reputation-based deterrents. Certain ships, or groups associated with piracy, became known not through direct confrontation alone, no, but through accumulated stories of behaviour. You begin to feel how identity at sea becomes fluid yet influential. The ship continues forward, steady and deliberate. Each wave is met with practiced resistance, each adjustment made without hesitation. You can sense how deeply experience shapes maritime survival. Nothing here is improvised in the moment. Everything is built on repetition. There is a quiet emotional tension beneath this structure, a sense that something is always approaching, even when nothing is visible. Sailors learn to live inside this tension, where anticipation becomes normal and surprise becomes rare but significant. You imagine a lookout scanning the horizon for hours, not expecting certainty but watching for deviation. A captain making decisions based not only on what is seen, but on what is known to happen in similar conditions. A crew adjusting silently to invisible probabilities. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that in this environment, piracy becomes increasingly tied to behavioral prediction rather than brute force. Understanding when ships move, how they move, and why they move becomes the foundation of successful maritime interception strategies. A faint roll of the ship shifts your perspective again. The horizon tilts slightly before returning to balance. It is a small reminder that stability here is always temporary. The ocean never fully agrees to remain still, and within this evolving system of reputation, anticipation, and structured maritime movement, figures of piracy begin to emerge not as isolated anomalies, but as recognizable presences within the larger rhythm of the sea. The ocean continues forward, carrying every rumour, every route, and every expectation across the same unbroken surface. The sea feels more crowded now, even though you cannot see most of what fills it. It is as if the water itself has learned to carry invisible stories, each one tied to ships that have passed, or ships that might pass soon. You're entering a world where reputation begins to travel faster than sails, and where identity on the ocean becomes something both powerful and fragile. The ship beneath you moves with a steady, deliberate rhythm, like a living thing that has long accepted the weight of constant travel. Timber creaks in familiar patterns, ropes tighten and release in practiced cycles, and the sails above adjust to wind that feels increasingly like part of a system rather than random force. The air is thick with salt, sun-dried canvas, and the faint trace of distant ports carried across long ocean paths. As maritime networks expand further across colonial waters, the importance of information begins to rival the importance of physical strength. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggest that communication among sailors, merchants, and port authorities becomes a defining feature of maritime security. You begin to sense how knowledge itself becomes a kind of armour on the sea. Your mind drifts into port corridors filled with quiet urgency. Messages pass through the hands that do not belong to official channels. A sailor overhears a detail and repeats it elsewhere. A dock worker notices a ship's cargo and remembers it later in conversation. Nothing here is fully formal, yet everything influences decision-making. Within this environment, piracy becomes increasingly shaped by recognition. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that in this period. The ability to identify ships, routes, and patterns at a distance becomes as important as direct confrontation. You begin to feel how observation turns into power long before any encounter occurs. A faint shift in the ship's movement draws your attention. The vessel leans slightly into the wind, correcting itself with quiet precision. It feels almost like the sea and the ship are negotiating with each other, finding balance through continuous adjustment rather than fixed control. The smell of damp rope intensifies briefly as a sailor adjusts rigging above. It carries a grounding quality, reminding you of physical labour that sustains everything else, every sail, every knot. Every adjustment contributes to a larger system that only functions through constant attention. You begin to imagine distant waters where ships move with increasing caution. Captains rely not only on maps, but on accumulated knowledge of behaviour. Which routes are commonly used? Which seasons increase traffic? Which waters are known for unpredictability? Every decision becomes layered with inference. Historical research preserved through academic traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that maritime communication networks during this period were highly decentralized. Information flowed through informal channels, often faster than official records could respond. You start to see how this creates a world where perception can shape reality before events even occur. The horizon feels subtly different now, not because it has changed physically, but because your awareness of it has deepened. Every distant point feels loaded with potential meaning. Every empty stretch of water feels like a pause before possible arrival. A soft breeze crosses the deck, carrying a faint coolness that contrasts with the warmth of earlier sunlight. It brings with it the scent of open water mixed with something distant and earthy. Like land remembered through wind, the ocean no longer feels isolated. It feels connected to countless unseen directions at once. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that the expansion of maritime trade created a system where predictability itself became a resource. Ships moved along increasingly defined corridors, and that predictability allowed both commerce and interception to evolve in parallel. You begin to feel how order and risk grow together rather than separately. You imagine the mental landscape of sailors crossing these waters, a constant awareness of other vessels that may or may not be nearby, a habit of scanning the horizon even when nothing is expected, a readiness that never fully relaxes, even in calm conditions. There is a quiet emotional shift here, subtle but persistent. The sea begins to feel less like an open expanse and more like a layered environment of unseen interactions. Even silence carries implication. Even distance carries structure. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that piracy during this period becomes increasingly dependent on reading these layered patterns. It is not enough to act quickly. One must understand timing, expectation, and deviation from normal maritime behaviour. You begin to see how intelligence becomes inseparable from action. The ship continues forward, its motion steady but never identical from moment to moment. Each wave slightly alters its path. Each gust of wind adjusts its posture. Yet it maintains direction through constant correction, a balance between force and response. You can almost feel the collective awareness of everyone aboard. Even without spoken words, there is shared understanding of the environment. The horizon is watched, the wind is read, the water is interpreted. Every small sign becomes part of a larger language, and within this expanding system of communication, reputation, and behavioral prediction, piracy continues to develop not as an external disruption, but as an adaptive presence embedded within the very logic of maritime movement. The ocean carries everything forward, shaped by knowledge, expectation, and the silent weight of unseen routes beneath its endless surface. The sea begins to feel less like a route and more like a ledger, silently recording every movement that passes across it. You are now deep inside a maritime world where value is no longer only carried in cargo, but also in information, timing, and the invisible trust between ports and ships. The ship beneath you creaks with steady endurance, its wooden frame adjusted over years of use and repair. Every sound feels slightly more meaningful now, as if even the smallest groan of timber is part of a larger conversation between vessel and ocean. The sails above respond to wind with practiced ease, their motion smooth but never fully predictable. The air tastes of what aging rope furrows, and distant smoke drifting from unseen coastlines. As global trade expands further into interconnected colonial networks, the flow of goods becomes more structured and more valuable. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggest that the growing concentration of wealth in predictable maritime routes directly contributes to increased vulnerability along those same corridors. You begin to feel how efficiency creates exposure without intending to. Your mind drifts into busy sea lanes where ships move in staggered patterns across vast distances. Each vessel carries cargo that represents not just wealth, but entire systems of production and labour on land. Sugar, tobacco, textiles, bauxite, metals, and provisions all move through the same invisible channels of water. The ocean becomes a moving archive of economic life. Within this system, piracy begins to function less as isolated disruption and more as a calculated response to structure. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that when economic systems become predictable, they also become readable. You begin to understand how repetition in trade creates opportunity for those who learn to observe it carefully. A faint shift in the ship's movement draws your awareness downward. The hull meets water with steady resistance, cutting through small waves that ripple outward like scattered signals. It feels as though the ocean itself is continuously testing the vessel, responding to its presence with subtle variations in pressure. The smell of damp wood grows stronger for a moment, mixing with a hint of tar heated by sun exposure. You notice how sensory details here are never isolated. Every smell, sound, and motion is tied to something larger, something systemic. Nothing exists alone on the sea. You begin to imagine the rhythm of ports far away, where ships arrive and depart in carefully structured cycles. Merchants track timing with increasing precision. Insurance arrangements depend on expected travel durations. Entire economies begin to rely on the assumption that movement across water can be predicted with reasonable consistency. Historical research preserved through academic traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that this increasing predictability of maritime logistics unintentionally strengthened informal intelligence networks. Sailors, dock workers, and traders exchanged information about schedules, cargo values, and ship conditions in ways that were rarely documented but widely used. You start to see how the knowledge becomes a parallel infrastructure supporting everything else. The horizon feels subtly different now. It is not closer or farther, but more segmented. You begin to sense invisible divisions across open water, shaped by trade routes, wind systems, and habitual navigation patterns. The sea is no longer uniform space. It is structured flow. A soft breeze passes across the deck, carrying the faint scent of distant vegetation and warm coastal air. It contrasts gently with the cooler ocean wind, suggesting proximity to land even when none is visible. This blending of air masses gives the environment a layered feeling, as if multiple worlds overlap at the edges of perception. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that the expansion of maritime commerce created self-reinforcing cycles of predictability. The more frequently ships travelled established routes, the more those routes became reinforced as standard pathways, further concentrating traffic and increasing both efficiency and exposure. You begin to feel how systems naturally settle into patterns that can later be understood and anticipated. You imagine sailors navigating through these conditions, relying on accumulated experience rather than certainty. A glance at the sky to confirm wind direction, a pause before entering known high-traffic waters, a quiet awareness that every route carries both opportunity and risk simultaneously. There is a growing emotional weight beneath this structured world. Not fear, but sustained alertness. A sense that nothing is ever fully resolved at sea. Every voyage is part of something larger, unfinished, and constantly shifting. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that piracy during this period becomes increasingly integrated into the logic of maritime predictability. Rather than random acts, it evolves into a response shaped by understanding of economic timing, seasonal movement, and behavioral repetition. You begin to see how closely observation and action are tied together. The ship continues forward with steady confidence, its movement uninterrupted by anything visible on the horizon. Yet even in this calm, there is an undercurrent of expectation, the awareness that movement attracts attention, that routes imply encounters, that nothing travels unnoticed forever. You feel the ocean as a connected system now, where every ship contributes to a larger pattern of flow and anticipation. Cargo, timing, wind, and human intention all converge into a single dynamic structure that is constantly being read and responded to. And within this increasingly organized world of maritime predictability and invisible observation, piracy continues to evolve not as an external force, but as an embedded function of the system itself. Shaped by the very structures that enable global trade, the sea moves forward without interruption, carrying structure, expectation, and adaptation together across its vast and unbroken surface. The sea begins to feel more guarded now, as if invisible boundaries have been drawn across it by years of experience and repeated encounters. You are moving through waters where awareness itself has become a form of protection, and where every voyage carries the weight of what has been learned before. The ship beneath you feels heavier in its motion, not from cargo alone, but from caution. Every adjustment of sail is more deliberate, every shift in direction more considered. The wood creaks with a deeper tone, as if it has been reinforced by countless voyages that demanded resilience. The air is sharp with salt, damp rope, and the faint trace of smoke carried from distant coastal settlements. As maritime trade reaches unprecedented scale across Atlantic and Caribbean routes, naval powers begin to respond with increasing coordination. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggest that organized protection of trade routes becomes a defining feature of this period. You begin to sense how the sea transforms when observation becomes systematic. Your mind drifts toward escorted convoys moving through contested waters, ships traveling together in carefully arranged formations, each one aware of the other's position. The presence of armed escorts changes the atmosphere entirely. Even distance feels different when protection is shared. Within this environment, piracy begins to adapt rather than retreat. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that maritime disruption does not disappear under increased enforcement. Instead, it shifts behavior, adjusting timing, location, and method. You begin to feel how pressure reshapes movement rather than eliminating it. A subtle shift in the ship's motion draws your attention. The vessel responds to wind with measured precision, as if every adjustment has been practiced countless times before. The sea itself feels more segmented here, with routes that are actively monitored and contested. The smell of tar and salt intensifies briefly as a crew member adjusts rigging above. It is a reminder that vigilance is constant. Nothing on the ship is ever truly idle. Even rest exists within layers of readiness. You imagine the tension of approaching high-risk waters, conversations becoming quieter, movements more deliberate, eyes scanning the horizon not out of curiosity, but out of trained habit. Even the act of listening changes, as sailors begin to interpret silence as a meaningful condition rather than absence. Historical research preserved through academic traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that increased naval enforcement during this period leads to a transformation in pirate behavior rather than its disappearance. Groups that once relied on opportunistic encounters begin to adjust by studying patrol patterns, seasonal changes, and convoy schedules. You begin to understand how adaptation becomes the core survival mechanism. The horizon feels more structured now, not physically divided, but mentally mapped. You begin to sense where danger is more likely to appear, even without evidence. The sea becomes a space of interpreted risk, where knowledge of patterns shapes expectation. A soft wind passes across the deck, carrying a colder edge than before. It brings with it the faint scent of distant rain and faraway land, reminding you that even heavily monitored waters are still part of a larger natural system. Weather remains beyond control, even when human systems attempt to account for it. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that the expansion of naval protection systems during this era creates a dynamic equilibrium between enforcement and evasion. As protection increases, so does the sophistication of avoidance strategies. You begin to feel how movement on the sea becomes a constant negotiation between visibility and concealment. You imagine ships altering routes slightly, not abandoning them, but bending around known patrol zones. Small adjustments in timing, subtle changes in speed, calculated pauses near islands or coastlines. Every movement becomes a response to awareness of being watched. There is a quiet human dimension within this structured tension, a captain delaying departure by hours to avoid expected patrol cycles, a sailor watching the horizon with a different kind of attention, knowing that visibility now carries consequence, a merchant recalculating risk not only in terms of weather or distance, but in terms of interception probability. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that piracy in this phase becomes increasingly dependent on strategic patience and environmental reading. It is no longer just about strength or speed. It becomes about timing within systems that are themselves constantly adjusting. The ship continues forward, steady but alert, moving through waters that feel both open and monitored at the same time. Every ripple of water seems to carry potential meaning. Every distant shape carries interpretive weight. You begin to understand that the sea is no longer just a space of movement. It is a space of awareness, where both sides of maritime activity, protection and disruption, evolve together in response to each other. And within this increasingly structured environment of surveillance, adaptation, and counter-movement, piracy continues to refine itself not as a disappearance, but as an evolving shadow shaped by the very systems designed to contain it. The ocean moves forward unchanged in appearance, yet deeply transformed in behavior, carrying both order and resistance across its endless surface. The sea feels tighter now, as if the open water has quietly contracted under the weight of constant watchfulness. You are moving through an era where control and resistance begin to mirror each other so closely that they almost become indistinguishable. Every voyage feels observed, even when nothing is visible on the horizon. The ship beneath you moves with restrained discipline. Its motion is still smooth, but there is a subtle hesitation in every adjustment, as if the vessel itself is aware of unseen eyes. The wood creaks in familiar patterns, yet each sound seems slightly more deliberate. The air is colder now, carrying salt, damp vibur, and the faint metallic scent of weapons stored below deck. As naval enforcement intensifies across major maritime routes, systems of maritime justice begin to develop with greater consistency. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggest that the expansion of formal naval authority leads to more structured efforts to capture, detain, and prosecute those accused of piracy. You begin to feel how law itself becomes a visible presence at sea. Your mind drifts into harbours where captured crews are brought ashore under guard. Wooden docks echo with footsteps that feel heavier than ordinary labour. Chains clink softly, not in chaos, but in order. Every movement is recorded in some form, even if imperfectly. The sea no longer ends at the shoreline. Its consequences extend inland. Within this tightening structure, piracy does not vanish, it changes form. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that increased enforcement produces adaptation rather than elimination. Groups operating outside legal authority begin to develop new methods of concealment, timing, and dispersal. You begin to understand how pressure refines behavior rather than erasing it. A slow roll of the ship beneath your feet reminds you that motion remains constant, even as human systems around it become more rigid. The ocean does not respond to law, it responds only to force, wind, and distance. Everything else is interpretation layered on top of movement. The smell of tar grows stronger as maintenance work continues somewhere above deck. You notice how maintenance itself becomes part of survival. A poorly secured rope, a weakened sail, or a delayed repair can shift the outcome of entire voyages. Nothing here is ever fully separate from consequence. You imagine ships being inspected at ports with increasing scrutiny, cargo examined more carefully, logs reviewed with suspicion, crew identities questioned. Even routine arrivals carry an undercurrent of tension, as if every vessel must justify its passage through increasingly regulated waters. Historical research preserved through academic traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that maritime justice systems during this period became both more formal and more uneven at the same time. While some regions developed structured naval courts and consistent enforcement, others remained inconsistent, allowing gaps where informal activity could still persist. You begin to see how uneven structure creates opportunity. The horizon feels different again, not in shape, but in meaning. It is no longer just a boundary between known and unknown. It feels like a monitored threshold, a space where movement is expected to be accounted for. Even distance feels documented. A faint breeze passes across the deck, carrying the scent of distant rain and colder coastal air. It brushes against your skin with a sharper edge, reminding you that environmental conditions still operate independently of human control. Storms, currents, and winds remain outside jurisdiction. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that the expansion of naval enforcement during this era creates a complex balance between visibility and concealment. As surveillance increases, so too does the sophistication of avoidance strategies. You begin to feel how systems evolve together, each shaping the other in the continuous response. You imagine vessels moving in quieter patterns now, avoiding heavily monitored corridors, adjusting timing with greater precision, and relying more heavily on indirect routes. Even silence between ports begins to carry strategic meaning. Absence becomes intentional rather than accidental. There is a deeper emotional texture emerging beneath this structured environment, a sense of sustained vigilance that never fully resolves into rest. Sailors learn to exist within this condition, where awareness becomes continuous and uncertainty never fully disappears. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that piracy during this phase increasingly relies on fragmentation rather than direct confrontation. Instead of unified groups, smaller and more flexible operations emerge, adapting quickly to enforcement pressure. You begin to see how decentralization becomes a survival strategy. The ship continues forward, steady but restrained, moving through waters that feel increasingly layered with observation and expectation. Every wave feels like part of a monitored system. Every horizon feels like a boundary of awareness. You begin to understand that the sea is no longer just a space of movement or trade. It is a space of interaction between systems of control and systems of adaptation, both continuously adjusting in response to each other. And within this evolving environment of enforcement, fragmentation and adaptation, piracy persists not as a singular force, but as a shifting reflection of the very structures attempting to contain it. The ocean moves forward unchanged in form, yet deeply transformed in its invisible logic beneath the surface. The sea begins to feel wider again, but not in freedom, in scale. It is as if the more tightly it is controlled, the more it expands in complexity. You are now entering the peak of a world where piracy, trade, and empire all collide in constant motion, each shaping the other in ways that are no longer simple to separate. The ship beneath you moves with a quieter confidence. Its motions are practiced, but there is an underlying awareness in every adjustment, as if it has learned what kinds of waters demand caution and what kinds allow speed. The wood underfoot creaks in long, familiar tones, like a language spoken too often to notice any more. The air is dense with salt, rope fibres, and the faint metallic hint of distant gunpowder that never fully disappears from this era. As global maritime trade reaches its most intense phase in the so-called Golden Age of Piracy, shipping networks become deeply interconnected across ocean. Historical interpretations associated with the institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggest that this period represents a convergence point where economic expansion and naval enforcement reach maximum interaction. You begin to feel how density itself becomes a force at sea. Your mind drifts across vast ocean corridors where ships move in overlapping paths like threads woven through water. Every route is shared, repeated, and reinforced by necessity. Merchant vessels, naval escorts, private armed ships, and independent sailors all occupy the same space, creating a layered system of movement that never fully rests. Within this environment, piracy reaches its most visible and complex form. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that this era is not defined by chaos alone, but by structured conflict within highly organized trade systems. You begin to understand how order and disruption become indistinguishable when they operate within the same network. A subtle shift in the ship's motion draws your attention downward. The hull presses through waves with steady force, each impact softened by experience. The sea feels busier here, as if filled with unseen trajectories crossing in every direction. Even calm water feels layered with invisible activity. The smell of tar and damp canvas intensifies briefly as a crew member adjusts rigging overhead. It is a small, routine action, yet it carries the weight of constant maintenance required to survive long voyages. Nothing here can be left unattended. Everything demands care. You imagine the ocean at night during this period. Not empty, but populated by vessels moving without direct sight of one another. Lantern light flickers across waves. Shadows shift between mast lines. The darkness does not hide the sea, it multiplies it. Historical research preserved through academic traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that maritime systems during this time become highly sensitive to timing and coordination. Seasonal winds, convoy schedules, and port cycles create predictable rhythms that shape nearly every major voyage. You begin to feel how rhythm itself becomes structure. The horizon no longer feels like a simple line. It feels like a threshold of probability. Beyond it, ships are not just possible, they're expected. Even absence becomes meaningful, suggesting timing rather than emptiness. A cool wind passes across the deck, carrying the scent of distant rain and open land far beyond sight. It brushes against your skin like a reminder that even in highly structured maritime systems, natural forces remain beyond full control. Weather still interrupts prediction. Storms still reshape expectation. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that the height of maritime trade complexity creates a system where multiple layers of adaptation coexist simultaneously. Enforcement, evasion, commerce, and communication all evolve together, constantly responding to each other in real time. You begin to feel how systems do not stabilize, they equilibrate through motion. You imagine ships adjusting their behavior in subtle ways, slight delays before entering known zones, adjusted speeds to align with convoy movements, changes in routes based on rumor, weather, or observation. Every decision becomes part of a larger pattern of calculated uncertainty. There is a quiet emotional weight beneath this system, a sense of constant awareness that never resolves. Sailors live inside this condition for months, sometimes years, where every horizon carries both opportunity and risk simultaneously. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that piracy during this peak period becomes increasingly integrated into the logic of maritime structure itself. It does not exist outside the system, but within its margins, exploiting timing, density, and predictability. You begin to see how the edges of order generate their own forms of movement. The ship continues forward with steady persistence. Each wave is met with practiced resistance. Each adjustment feels part of a larger choreography shaped by experience and necessity. The ocean remains constant in appearance, yet infinitely complex in behavior. You begin to understand that this world is no longer defined by simple opposition between lawful and unlawful movement. Instead, it is defined by interaction between systems that continuously reshape each other. And within this dense, interconnected, and constantly shifting maritime environment, piracy reaches its most developed form, not as an anomaly, but as an embedded reflection of the very networks that sustain global trade. The sea moves forward without pause, carrying every route, every decision, and every shadow together across its vast and layered surface. The sea feels darker now, not in colour, but in depth of meaning. You're moving through waters where the consequences of trade are no longer abstract. They're embedded in every route, every ship, every quiet decision made far from shore. The ocean feels less like a pathway, and more like a system carrying both wealth and its hidden costs. The ship beneath you moves with a steady but heavier rhythm. Each plank creaks as if it has absorbed too many voyages to remain indifferent. The sails above respond to wind with disciplined precision, but even their motion feels slightly restrained, as if operating under constant awareness of unseen conditions. The air carries salt, damp rope, and a faint tension that never fully leaves maritime life in this era. As global trade networks expand further across the Atlantic world, they become increasingly entangled with systems of forced labour and resource extraction. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggest that maritime commerce during this period is inseparable from broader economic structures that shape entire continents. You begin to feel how deeply connected movement on the sea is to forces on land. Your mind drifts into vast shipping routes linking plantations, ports, and colonial centres. Ships carry not only goods, but the output of entire systems of production shaped by inequality and coercion. Sugar, tobacco, textiles, and other commodities move through the same channels of water that also carry naval patrols and independent vessels. The sea becomes a mirror of global imbalance. Within this system, piracy interacts with trade in complex and often indirect ways. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that maritime disruption cannot be understood in isolation from the economic systems it intersects with. You begin to see how piracy, trade, and enforcement all emerge from the same interconnected structure of movement and value. A slow roll of the ship beneath your feet reminds you that everything here depends on continuous adjustment. The ocean is never still, and neither are the systems built upon it. Every voyage is shaped by forces that are both natural and human, often indistinguishable in their effects. The smell of tar and salt intensifies briefly, mixed with the faint scent of distant land carried on shifting wind. It feels like a reminder that every route connects multiple worlds. No journey exists in isolation. Each crossing is part of a much larger circulation of goods, people, and consequences. You imagine ships moving through long, established corridors where timing is everything. A delay at a port can ripple across entire supply chains. A missed convoy can alter economic outcomes far inland. Even silence between ports carries meaning, as absence becomes a signal rather than emptiness. Historical research preserved through academic traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that maritime systems during this period develop increasingly sophisticated logistical rhythms. Seasonal cycles, wind patterns, and trade agreements create predictable flows that structure nearly every major voyage. You begin to feel how predictability becomes both efficiency and vulnerability at the same time. The horizon feels broader now, but also more segmented. It is no longer a single open line. It feels like a sequence of zones, each shaped by different conditions of control, weather, and traffic. Even open water begins to feel organized into invisible layers. A cool wind passes across the deck, carrying the scent of distant rain and vegetation from unseen coastlines. It brushes against your skin with a clarity that momentarily sharpens awareness. The sea remains physically unchanged, yet emotionally it feels more complex than ever before. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that maritime systems during this era operate as adaptive networks where multiple forces interact simultaneously. Economic pressure, enforcement strategies, environmental conditions, and informal activity all influence one another in continuous feedback loops. You begin to understand how stability is never static but constantly negotiated. You imagine ships adjusting to these conditions in subtle, almost invisible ways, routes slightly altered to avoid known enforcement zones, timing adjusted to match seasonal patterns, communication passed through indirect channels to reduce exposure. Every decision becomes part of a larger adaptive rhythm. There is a quiet emotional gravity beneath this structured world, a sense that everything is connected through motion, yet nothing remains fully secure. Sailors live within this awareness for long periods, learning to interpret uncertainty as a normal condition rather than an exception. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that piracy in this period becomes deeply intertwined with global economic structure, particularly in regions where enforcement is uneven or stretched across vast distances. It does not exist outside the system, but adapts within its gaps, responding to density, timing, and opportunity. The ship continues forward with steady determination. Each wave is absorbed and corrected. Each shift in wind is met with practiced adjustment. The ocean remains constant in appearance, but beneath its surface, it carries an intricate and evolving structure of human activity. You begin to understand that this world is not defined by separation between lawful and unlawful movement. It is defined by the interaction between systems that continuously shape each other through pressure and response. And within this deeply interconnected maritime environment, piracy exists not as an external disruption, but as an embedded reflection of global movement itself, shaped by the same forces that sustain trade across oceans. The sea moves forward without interruption, carrying every flow of value, labour, and adaptation across its endless and interconnected surface. The sea begins to feel quieter again, but it is not peace. It is exhaustion spread across vast distance, like a system that has been running for so long it no longer announces its own effort. You are now moving through the late phase of a world where piracy has been pushed, reshaped, and dispersed, yet never fully erased. The ship beneath you moves with restrained confidence. Every motion feels economical, as if nothing is wasted anymore. Not wind, not effort, not attention. The wood creaks in lower tones now, worn down by countless voyages that have left invisible marks in every beam. The sails respond to wind with careful precision, adjusted more by habit than urgency. The air carries salt, old tar, and the faint dryness of long travel through heavily used routes. As naval power expands and consolidates across major maritime empires, coordinated suppression of piracy becomes increasingly systematic. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggests that improved naval technology, stronger patrol networks, and more centralised authority gradually reduce large-scale piracy activity in heavily monitored regions. You begin to feel how control spreads unevenly across space, stronger in some waters, weaker in others. Your mind drifts through a changing ocean where once crowded corridors begin to thin. Ships still travel, but with more structure, more oversight, and more predictable protection. Convoys become more common, naval escorts more visible. The sense of unmonitored movement slowly diminishes in major routes. Within this transformation, piracy does not disappear abruptly, it fragments. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that suppression of large organized maritime raiding leads to dispersion into smaller, more localized, and less visible forms of activity. You begin to understand how pressure reshapes scale rather than eliminating behavior entirely. A gentle roll of the ship beneath your feet reminds you that the sea itself remains unchanged by these human developments. It continues to move as it always has, indifferent to enforcement, borders, or systems of control. Waves still form without permission, currents still shift without notice. The smell of damp rope and salt grows faintly stronger as the wind shifts. It feels like a reminder that even in structured systems, the environment retains its independence. Weather still disrupts schedules, storms still alter routes. No amount of organization fully removes uncertainty. You imagine ports that once served as chaotic hubs of overlapping activity now becoming more regulated, more orderly, and more controlled. Dockside inspections increase, records become more formal, naval presence becomes a constant visual reminder of authority. The sea's edges begin to reflect the discipline of inland governance. Historical research preserved through academic traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that the decline of large-scale piracy correlates closely with the expansion of state naval capacity and improved communication between maritime enforcement zones. You begin to see how information and coordination become as important as firepower. The horizon feels calmer now, but also emptier, not because there is less movement, but because movement has become more predictable. The sense of uncertainty that once defined open water begins to fade in major corridors. A cool wind passes across the deck, carrying the scent of distant rain and faint vegetation from unseen shores. It feels less intense than before, softer, as if the sea itself has settled into a more regulated rhythm. Yet beneath that calm surface, complexity still exists. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that even as piracy declines in heavily patrolled waters, maritime systems continue to generate smaller pockets of adaptation. Where oversight increases, movement shifts. Where enforcement tightens, behavior disperses. You begin to feel how systems respond elastically to pressure. You imagine sailors operating in this changing environment. Fewer encounters with uncertainty in major routes, but increased awareness of alternative paths, more reliance on official channels, but still dependent on informal knowledge passed between crews. The sea becomes more structured, but never fully uniform. There is a quiet emotional tone emerging in this phase, a sense of transition rather than conclusion. The ocean feels like it is remembering older states of itself while adapting to new ones. Nothing fully disappears, it simply changes density and distribution. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that the legacy of piracy persists even after its decline in visible form, embedded in maritime law, navigation practices, and cultural memory. You begin to understand how historical systems leave traces long after their peak activity has passed. The ship continues forward, steady and controlled, moving through waters that feel increasingly ordered, yet still alive with underlying complexity. Each wave meets the hull with familiar resistance, Each adjustment of sail reflects accumulated knowledge of how the sea behaves under different conditions. You begin to see the ocean not as a battleground between order and disorder, but as a continuous field where both have always coexisted, shifting in proportion rather than opposition. And within this late stage of maritime history, piracy remains not as a dominant force, but as a dispersed echo of earlier systems, still present in form, but transformed by the expanding reach of organised control. The sea moves forward without resistance, carrying memory, structure, and adaptation together across its vast and enduring surface. The sea feels older now, as if it has carried too many centuries of movement to feel new in any direction. You're drifting through the aftermath of an era, where stories have begun to settle into memory rather than action, and where the shape of piracy is no longer defined by presence, but by what it has left behind. The ship beneath you moves with quiet certainty. It is no longer testing the water, only accepting it. Every plank seems familiar with long-distance travel, every rope stretched into a pattern shaped by repetition rather than urgency. The sails respond to wind with minimal correction, as if the vessel has learned to trust the sea more than it resists it. The air is cool, carrying salts of faded tar, and the faint stillness of routes that have been travelled too often to feel uncertain, as maritime empires stabilise their control over major ocean corridors. Historical interpretations associated with institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggest that the golden age of large-scale piracy gradually dissolves into a more regulated global system of naval enforcement and commercial navigation. You begin to feel how history does not end sharply, but thins out like ink slowly fading across water. Your mind drifts through the contrast between earlier chaos and present order. Where once there were unpredictable encounters, there are now structured patrols. Where rumours once shaped entire voyages, formal communication systems now dominate. The ocean feels less like a field of unknown possibility and more like a managed environment of controlled movement. Within this transformation, piracy becomes something that survives more in interpretation than in reality. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that historical memory tends to preserve intensity even after practical conditions change. You begin to understand how legends grow stronger as their material conditions weaken. A slow, steady motion carries the ship forward. The hull no longer fights the water. It glides through it with practiced ease. The sound of waves against wood is consistent, almost soothing, like a rhythm that no longer demands attention. Yet beneath that calm surface, the sea still holds depth and unpredictability, even if it is less visible now. The smell of salt and aged timber feels softer here, less immediate than ever before. It is no longer the scent of survival, but of continuity. You notice how the ocean changes its emotional tone over time, even when its physical form remains unchanged. You imagine ports that once feared sudden raids now operating under stable systems of governance. Records are maintained with care, naval forces are permanently stationed, trade routes are mapped with precision. The sea becomes less a frontier and more an extension of administrative order. Historical research preserved through academic traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that the decline of widespread piracy coincides with the maturation of global maritime law and the expansion of coordinated naval infrastructure. You begin to feel how systems that once competed begin to synchronize. The horizon feels calm, but it carries a strange sense of finality, not an ending, but a settling. The ocean no longer feels like it is holding its breath, it feels like it has exhaled into structure. A faint breeze passes across the deck, cooler than before, carrying the distant scent of land that is now more accessible, more charted, more predictable. Even distance feels reduced by knowledge and mapping. The unknown has not disappeared, but it has been narrowed. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that the mythology of piracy expands even as its practical influence diminishes. Stories become more vivid as the reality becomes more controlled. You begin to see how cultural memory preserves turbulence long after systems stabilize. You imagine sailors telling older tales in quieter ports, stories of unpredictable waters, of sudden encounters, of ships that disappeared into uncertain horizons. These stories persist not as current reality, but as inherited atmosphere, shaping how later generations understand the sea. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that the legacy of piracy becomes embedded in maritime identity itself, influencing language, literature, and perceptions of freedom and law at sea long after its historical peak. You begin to understand how absence can still generate presence through memory. The ship continues forward, steady and unhurried, moving through waters that feel increasingly integrated into a global system of order. Every movement is now part of a larger continuity rather than disruption. You begin to feel that the sea has not lost its complexity. It has simply reorganized it. What once appeared as conflict now appears as structure. What once felt unpredictable now feels distributed across systems of knowledge and control. And within this final reflection of the Golden Age of Piracy, what remains is not chaos or conquest, but the transformation of movement itself. From uncertainty into pattern, from fear into history, the ocean carries everything forward in sameness, holding both memory and order across its endless and unbroken surface. The sea feels different now, not because it has changed, but because you have. It no longer presents itself as a place of uncertainty or pursuit. It feels like a completed system, one that has absorbed centuries of movement, conflict, adaptation, and order, and carried them forward into something calmer, but not simpler. The ship beneath you moves with quiet finality. Every motion is smooth, almost effortless, as if the vessel is no longer proving anything to the ocean. The wood creaks softly in familiar rhythm, a sound that no longer signals tension, only continuity. The sails respond to wind with minimal correction, and the wind itself feels less like a force to be negotiated and more like a condition to be accepted. The air carries salt, aged timber, and the distant stillness of long-finished routes. As global maritime systems transition fully into modern naval governance and structured international trade, historical interpretations associated with institutions such as Harvard University and the University of Cambridge suggest that the era once defined by large-scale piracy becomes absorbed into broader frameworks of law, commerce, and state authority. You begin to feel how history does not end, but reorganizes itself into quieter forms. Your mind drifts through the transformation of the ocean from contested space into managed connectivity. What was once defined by unpredictability now operates through schedules, mapped corridors, and coordinated enforcement. Ships still move, but their movement now belongs to systems that extend far beyond any single horizon. Within this final stage of reflection, piracy no longer exists as a dominant maritime reality. Scholars from Yale University and Stanford University often emphasize that what remains is its legacy, preserved in maritime law, cultural imagination, and the historical memory of global trade. You begin to understand how absence itself becomes a form of presence through remembrance. The ship continues forward with steady inevitability. The horizon no longer feels like a boundary of possibility or danger. It feels like continuity without interruption. Waves still rise and fall, but their rhythm no longer suggests threat or opportunity. They simply exist. Repeating patterns older than any human system that once crossed them. The scent of the sea is calmer now. Salt, water, and weather blend into something almost neutral. Even the creaking of the vessel feels integrated into the larger silence around it, as if sound itself has learned restraint. You notice how even perception softens when no longer shaped by urgency. You imagine archives on land where records of maritime conflict are preserved, ships logged, voyages recorded, encounters documented, scholars studying patterns long after the waters that produced them have settled into memory. Historical research preserved through academic traditions at the University of Chicago and Columbia University suggests that maritime history becomes increasingly interpretive over time, shaped as much by memory and narrative as by direct evidence. You begin to feel how the sea lives twice, once in experience and once in recollection. A faint breeze moves across the deck, carrying no particular message, only presence. It feels less directional than before, less charged with meaning. The ocean no longer seems to push toward anything, it simply continues. Some scholarly interpretations from institutions such as Princeton University and the University of Oxford suggest that the mythology of piracy outlives its practical era, becoming embedded in cultural identity, literature, and global storytelling traditions. You begin to understand how human systems preserve intensity even after conditions have changed, turning lived experience into enduring narrative. You imagine how future generations might picture this world, not as structured trade routes and adaptive systems, but as silhouettes of ships on open water, stories shaped by tension and freedom, danger and movement. The reality and the memory begin to diverge, each carrying its own truth. Scholars from Stanford University and Yale University often note that the enduring fascination with piracy reflects a deeper human relationship with uncertainty, autonomy, and the edge of controlled systems. You begin to see how the sea becomes a mirror for those themes, both in history and imagination. The ship continues forward, steady and unremarkable in its motion, as if concluding a long sentence that has finally reached its natural pause. There is no climax in the water, only continuation. And now, as this journey through the Golden Age of Piracy comes to rest, what remains is not violence, not treasure, and not even fear, but transformation itself, the slow shift of human systems across time, reshaping movement on the ocean from chaos into order, and from order into memory. The sea carries all of it without distinction, holding history, trade, piracy, and silence together in the same endless, patient expanse. Blessings to you and your family.